now with our means, enormously bigger means of communication. We have now what I call all kinds of electromagnetic information channels, telephone, telegraph, radio, television, and so on, internet. All these things make communication much easier. And more than that, travel, as practical it was also, is now. I mean, we cannot go all over the world in 24 hours, but we can, mostly. It's possible it can be done with some airplanes, but basically, the world is much smaller now. Now, in the past, it wasn't like this, because places that it took months to go from one continent to the other. But as I'm saying, Haig Gaon was the person that was accepted and acknowledged by all the Jews in the world. Those who somehow came to hear about him, not all of them had any kind of a direct contact, but they knew about him, and therefore she was the leader, the Jewish leader, even a great person, and he was so exceptional in so many ways, like Maimonides. In his lifetime, he was known within a certain area. That went in between, the Middle East, some countries around it, Italy, south of France, and that was about it. Later on, his name, of course, spread and grew with the time. But at the time, for that time, he wasn't known all over the world, the Jewish world. And he was not accepted as the leader of the Jewish people, with all his greatness and with all the honor that people gave him. Now, I'm saying Rabbi Haig Gaon was the last, but he was the last in the sense that he was the last leader of everybody. But he wasn't the last in the formally, he wasn't the end of the line. And so after him, things remained in a certain way as usual, but not as usual. Which means the system didn't collapse. The system went on, and the system, at least in Babylonia, Iraq, was more or less the same basic system, which was I would say, the triple rulership of the two heads of the yeshivot, the yeshiva of Pumbedita, yeshiva of Sura, and the Reish Galuta, the exilarch, who was so to say, the political leader of the Jews, surely under the Muslim rule. So this was, and these three were usually sometimes in an easy, in what I call a loving connection. Sometimes they're fighting with each other, which is again happens among the best. And so, but basically it was a three-party. The rulership was a triumvirate. And that's what went on for many years. We don't know exactly how long it was, but at least it was a system that stayed more or less stable for more than perhaps 500 years. Now, 500 years in any history is a sizable amount of time. And it was a combination of what's called it wasn't purely spiritual power, because the heads of the yeshivot had also their own political power and even financial power. The head of the exilarch was far more important politically than it was in knowledge. But basically, these three worked together to form a leadership of the Jews at least in these countries, and in a certain way, it oozed from there to many other places. They were the leaders, even though there were local leaders everywhere. Now, there were many reasons. big political reasons, and general political reasons. There were also Jewish reasons, and some of them were also connected with something that I mentioned before, last time and before last time. See, there was a time when I would say that the bulk, the numbers, and surely the important leadership of the Jews were in Babylonia. This was the place where the biggest number of Jews lived, and which you had a Jewish community, a creative Jewish community that was in a way leading all the others. The rest of the people were periphery. Some of them were living, as I say, in those times, say around the year 1000. There were Jews already in most parts of Western Europe. Jews were in Germany from the 2nd century in Germany. Jews were living in France before it was called France. In fact, Jews came to Germany before the Germans came to Germany. The Germans came to Germany later, and when the Jews came there, they were Goths, Ostrogoths, Westgoths, but they were not Germans. The Germans came in a way later. So Jews came there before. In France, it was surely the same thing. The Jews came to France when it was Gallia, Gaul. The Franks that made French, called this name, came much later. So Jews lived in France before the Frenchmen lived there. But anyway, Jews were there, and Jews were in Greece and Italy, and of course in Spain. So there were Jewish communities in Europe, and there were Jews in Egypt and in North Africa. But these Jewish communities they considered themselves, and they were practically, perhaps some of them did very well financially or in other ways, but culturally they knew that there is a center, and this is a center. It wasn't like Mitzion etc., but it was very, very similar to it. The center was from Psura and Pumbedita comes the Torah. And we, say in North Africa, or we in France, or we in any other country, we are just disciples. We receive their messages, we receive their orders, we receive whatever they have to tell us to do. That is what was. So it was for many years, and I say you spread slowly, sometimes willingly, because it seems that we have, as people, we have some kind of a certain bone, a certain nervous part of our nature is that we are not sitting very quietly in one place. We have something what they call itchy, and we move into other places, and in many times it was our choice. I mean, we were kicked out of so many places. I mean, the number of places for which Jews were exiled is huge. Countries, cities, and so on. So Jews were exiled, and they fled into other places. So in about this year, there were already some beginning of a Jewish community in Ukraine, and some were living around in what they call Czechoslovakia or Czech, in Bohemia of the time. So there were Jews all over the world. But all these communities were not only small, but basically all the Jewish nation was at that time. The numbers were not very big, but basically they were peripheral influence, peripheral in knowledge, and they saw themselves as disciples, as followers of the big leaders. But with the time, some of these places established some kind of not only of identity or language, but they established something of their own culture. it grew slowly, not intentionally, because somebody, let's say that the Jews that came into the, it was not then it was one big country, and the difference between France and Germany was unnoticed. But in the borderline, I say in the line between those places, there was a growing Jewish community, and this growing Jewish community began with sporadic writings of one person, another person, but it grew, and with the time, it got its own nature. See, I won't say that Jews became Frenchmen, but Jews became, unlike, let's say, the Jews in Mesopotamia and many other countries that spoke Arabic. Those Jews had their jargon. This was French. So the French jargon was a part when Rashi wants to mention, to explain a word that he doesn't have really an Hebrew equivalent, or people don't know the Hebrew equivalent. He uses what they call the tongue of the language of the country, the laws of that country. So you have French there. Now this French, incidentally, because historically speaking, most of the Ashkenazi Jews went to France in a certain period of time. We carried with us, as Ashkenazi Jews, we carried not only what I call some of the personality, some of the development, we carried also a part which was of the language. So we have little remnants of French in the Ashkenazi Jewry of all time. Now, you possibly, many Ashkenazi Jews never know that they speak French. But cholent is surely a French word. See, that is surely French. Cholent is French. It's French. It's one of the things that came to us, and a number of proper names. I've written a little piece about it. That the name, if you know a Jewish name, a Yiddish name, that is, it remained mostly with women, but not only. A name like Gente. You possibly heard the name Gente. It is a name. It's a proper name. It's not a nickname or a funny name. It's a name, a real name. But it remains still in France. It's a French name, basically. And in French now, it's just pronounced differently because the French changed the language. And because the French changed the language, now they call the same word, the same name. Gente is now called in France Jeannette. So if you see any gente moving about you should know that she's really a French lady called Jeannette. And there are similar things like this. But what I mentioned it not just to tell you that there were things like this, but people began there was a beginning of a culture. And at those times, let's say Rabbi Gaon, or a little bit later after him, there were already people in France, or Germany, France, that were already important people, that were really leaders in slightly, some of them in a political way, but also in the cultural way. Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or HaGolah was about a contemporary of Rabbi Gaon. So there were the people there were people in Italy, and there were people, as I mentioned before, in North Africa and in Spain. So all these centers began to grow. And the center in the old center in Babylonia became in a certain way slightly less important. See, because they grew in all kinds of places. They began as, so to say, colonies, but they became independent. Independent spiritually. They were not dependent in another way, but they became independent spiritually, and began to develop in sometimes slightly different ways, and sometimes in novel and exciting ways. See, what happened later on, for those years later, in the 11th century, 12th century, and 13th century in, say, in France, the huge Talmudic creativity of the place, which is, see, small communities, some of them of a few hundred people. These communities created giants. Somehow it doesn't happen in Israel today. That every small community of 300 creates what they call literary scholarly giants. They usually created some what they call municipal corruption at best, but it doesn't create this kind of things. That I see, Rashi lived in a very small town, and so Rabbeinu Gershom that lived in say Mainz, Magenta of those times, but also for the number of Jews were quite limited. But still they managed to create people there, and people of stature, of significant people that were there. So we are going back. I'm going back to the center in Babylonia. Now there was also something that happened there. It wasn't finished at the time, but Baghdad was for many years the capital city of the Muslim Empire, and even though there were some pieces that became independent, like Spain and sometimes also Egypt, but mainly it was still the capital of a big empire. These places as political centers, not for the Jews, but political centers for the country itself. The country also was becoming less and less what they call alive. It was from corruption to just degeneration. So in those years, you have the big Muslim center there in Baghdad. It's no longer not the only one, and there are some foreign rulers that came in, the Seljuk Khans and Sultans that came in, and they kept the old rulers as nominal heads of the government, as the Khalifa of whatever it was, but they were not. It was not the same tradition. And there were new people. Some of them were Turkish people. Some of them were combinations of Mongol and Turkish people that came into these places, and the big center, in a way, diminished in power. With that also was the diminishing in power of the Jewish center. The Jewish center it wasn't completely dependent on being in the capital, but still it had a connection. The Exilarch, Rosh HaGolah, was practically, in one way or another, appointed or approved by the local king, local Muslim king. Later on, the local Muslim king was himself a figurehead. So he couldn't give so much power to the Rosh HaGolah. And even as rulers, you see, there's one of the things that happened in many countries. Weak rulers don't become more liberal. Weak rulers have the tendency to become more dictatorial, more cruel, and more stupid. It is a matter that I'm not going now to speak about politics. Not only contemporary politics, but even about ancient politics. But there is a power. You see, when you have small, minuscule kind of people. You can't expect them to be extraordinary people in other ways. So everything becomes degenerated, and because of that, you see, I'm just speaking about the double things that happened. That on one hand, you had the political power of Baghdad diminished, and other centers became more and more powerful. In Spain and North Africa, they became practically independent. On the other hand, also among the Jews happened the same thing. Many of the local leaders they grew in power, in stature. And I'm speaking about you have now. It's not just by chance that we have more and more names that we know about, because these people were creative people, and so they left behind them books, poetry, some other things that were a part of a culture that grew up in all the outer parts of the Jewish world that became. After some time, they became the center. See, I spoke, one of my speeches was about that North Africa was for a time possibly the big center of the Jewish life. Later on, part of it went and grew up into the very, very big and important center in Spain. So Spain became the center of the Jewish world. And places like Egypt or Iraq became less important politically and Jewishly. Now, one of the points was we know the name of the person who was Rosh HaGolah at the time, and that was Chizkiyahu ben David. He was the Rosh HaGolah at the time, just possibly even in the later years of Rabbi Gaon. But at least he was there, perhaps a young man, who was Rosh HaGolah. He didn't have the same power as his forefathers. And I say, he didn't have not the political backing of the government, and even the Jews, they diminished. And the Jews, he was the prince of the Jews. But if the Jews don't want to pay taxes to their prince, so the prince is not glorious as it was before. And so it was, but there was Rosh HaGolah, and Rosh HaGolah was Chizkiyahu ben David.